I never thought I would have to fight to protect my family's land, until I received a call from Mrs. Thompson. She had lived next to my grandfather's farm for 40 years, and her voice trembled with anger as she informed me that bulldozers had begun leveling the eastern field. "They're building houses on your land, Henry." Her words echoed through the phone, leaving me in disbelief. I hastily threw a few sets of clothes into a suitcase and drove straight to Meadow Creek, my heart pounding with anger and confusion. As I turned onto the familiar dirt road leading to the farm, the sight before me left me frozen. The fields my grandfather once plowed had been torn apart into a massive construction site. Heavy trucks rumbled back and forth, excavators dug deep into the earth, and workers busily marked areas with bright orange paint. A sign stood prominently at the entrance, declaring, "The future of Sunny Pines East, 98 luxury homes, starting at $450,000. I marched straight toward a woman standing apart from the workers. She wore light-colored slacks, a crisp white blouse untouched by dust, and her hair was styled to perfection. When I confronted her, she raised an eyebrow, her voice smooth, yet distant. "We're preparing for a new residential community. Diane Reynolds, president of the Sunny Pines HOA." I didn't shake her hand. "This is my land," I stated firmly. "My grandfather, Joe Miller, owned this farm. He passed away last March, and I am the rightful heir." Diane remained unfazed, her thin smile unwavering. "There must be some misunderstanding. We purchased this land a year ago. The contract is valid and all permits are in order." My fists clenched. My grandfather would never sell this land. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes glinting with insincere sympathy. "Perhaps he forgot to tell you." I knew that was impossible. My grandfather may have been old, may have been sick, but his mind was always sharp. If he said he was keeping the farm in the family, he meant it. I didn't need promises. I needed proof. And I knew exactly where to start. The old office of my grandfather, the place where he had spent his life meticulously recording every detail about this farm. As I stepped inside, the familiar scent of tobacco and aged paper lingered in the air, as if time had never touched this place. The shelves lining the walls were packed with ledgers, farm schedules, and carefully arranged documents, each one a testament to a man who never overlooked a single detail. When I was a child, I used to sit on the floor, flipping through old notebooks while he slowly filled in rainfall measurements and crop reports. But this time, I wasn't here to reminisce. I needed answers. I began searching through the drawers, stacks of papers, and old filing boxes. Hours passed, and all I found were routine records, until my eyes landed on a folded sheet of paper, tucked inside an old leather journal. When I opened it, I realized it was the original farm map from 1910. The hand-drawn property lines were clearer than any modern document I had ever seen. And what shocked me the most, the farm wasn't 200 acres as I had always believed. According to this map, our land covered nearly 280 acres. My heart pounded as I continued digging, and then I found it, a small metal box, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under his desk. Using a pocket knife, I pried it open, my hands trembling as I unlocked it with a key hanging beneath the desk. Inside was a stack of yellowed documents and a handwritten letter from my grandfather. "If you're reading this, someone is trying to take our land." My breath caught as I read the next lines. My grandfather had known that real estate developers had been eyeing the farm for years. They had tried every trick to pressure him into selling, but he had always refused. In the final months of his life, a man from Sunny Pines had visited him multiple times under the guise of minor administrative paperwork. He suspected they had switched documents to steal the land he never intended to sell. I flipped through the documents inside the box, my eyes locking onto a paper with a scrawled signature at the bottom. No way. The signature didn't look like my grandfather's. The doubt that had been simmering inside me was now undeniable. Sunny Pines wasn't just building illegally on my land. They had done so through outright fraud. I couldn't sit back after what I had just uncovered. If Sunny Pines had truly forged documents to steal my family's land, I had to act immediately. The next morning, I drove straight to the office of attorney Daniel Stevenson, the man who could help me take them down, the only person in Meadow Creek I trusted to help me uncover the truth. As I stepped inside, His secretary looked up at me in surprise, but after I explained my situation, she quickly arranged a meeting. Daniel was an older man with graying hair and thick glasses that made him look like he had seen hundreds of complex legal battles. He carefully examined the old map, tracing his finger along the hand-drawn boundary lines from 1910. When I handed him the documents from my grandfather's metal box, he frowned, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Henry," he said after a few moments of silence, "this isn't just a misunderstanding. If what you're saying is true, then there's a strong possibility that someone forged documents to alter the property lines." I clenched my fists. I know my grandfather would never have signed away this land, and that signature on the transfer document, it doesn't look right. Daniel nodded. "We need to do two things immediately. First, I'll file a motion to halt all construction on your land. Second, we need to compare this document with the official records at the Land Registry office to see exactly how the property lines have changed over the years." He quickly called the Land Registry office, putting the call on speaker so I could listen in. After being transferred through several departments, we finally reached an employee who confirmed that a major boundary change had been recorded in 1997. When Daniel requested to review the detailed records, the employee hesitated before admitting that the document in question contained a highly unusual signature, one that didn't match any of my grandfather's previous records. I looked at Daniel, and he looked back at me with the same realization. This wasn't just a simple property dispute. This was a large-scale fraud, and Diane Reynolds and the Sunny Pines HOA might have been covering it up for years. But now, I had a clear path forward, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it for one more day. I left Daniel Stevenson's office with one goal: to stop construction on my land immediately. As I drove back to the farm, my phone buzzed. Daniel had already filed the lawsuit and submitted it to the county court. Less than 2 hours later, he called back with major news. The judge had granted an emergency injunction, ordering a complete halt to all construction until the property boundaries could be verified. I exhaled in relief, but I knew the real battle was just beginning. Dusk was settling in as I returned to the construction site. The excavators were still there, but their engines had gone silent. Workers were trickling out, some glancing at me with curiosity. But I wasn't concerned with them. I was looking for one person. And just as I expected, Diane Reynolds stood near her gleaming SUV, her phone still glued to her ear. The moment she saw me, her expression shifted instantly. "What is this?" she snapped, her voice as sharp as a blade. I said nothing, simply handing her a copy of the court order. She snatched it from my hand, skimmed through it, then let out a cold, dismissive laugh. "You really think this piece of paper will stop us? We have all the proper permits. These houses are nearly sold out. You can't stop the inevitable." I crossed my arms, keeping my voice steady. "The court has ordered a halt, and if you want to challenge it, be prepared to fight in court. I have the original map, my grandfather's documents, and proof of illegal boundary changes. If you think you can get away with this, I suggest you think again." Diane clenched the paper tightly, her cold eyes flickering with the slightest hint of uncertainty. Then, without another word, she turned away and dialed a number. I didn't need to hear the conversation to know what she was doing. She was calling in every favor she had in town to try and stop me. But I wasn't alone anymore. When I returned home, I found Mrs. Thompson waiting on the porch with 2 other elderly neighbors. "You did it," she said with a proud smile. "You made them stop." I nodded, but deep down, I knew the fight had only just begun. Diane Reynolds wasn't the type to back down easily, and I had a feeling that by morning, she would have already made her next move. This time, though, I was ready. The next morning, I was jolted awake by a loud, urgent knock at the door. When I opened it, a uniformed man stood on my porch, holding a thick envelope. "Henry Walker," his voice was firm. "That's me." He handed me the envelope. "Cease and desist order from the Sunny Pines HOA. You are required to withdraw all claims or face legal action." I tore open the envelope and scanned the contents. Diane Reynolds hadn't wasted any time striking back. The letter accused me of forging documents, damaging the reputation of the community, and demanded financial compensation. But the worst part wasn't the letter. It was what I saw when I looked outside. 3 white SUVs bearing the Sunny Pines HOA logo were parked across my driveway, blocking my access to the farm. Behind them, massive concrete barriers had been placed across the road. A security guard leaned against one of the SUVs, arms crossed as he watched me. I walked up, forcing myself to stay calm. "What are you doing here?" I asked. The guard shrugged. "This entrance hasn't been approved under HOA regulations. It's closed until further notice." I felt heat rise to my face. "This entrance is on my land." He didn't flinch. "According to county records, it falls under public access, managed by the HOA. I clenched my fists. Diane had moved faster than I expected. This was her strategy: apply pressure, cut off all access, and isolate me. I turned back into the house and called the sheriff's department, but the response I got was indifferent. "Sorry, this is a civil dispute. You'll need to resolve it with the HOA or take it to court." I gripped the phone tightly. Diane thought she could back me into a corner, but she forgot one thing. I wasn't someone who surrendered easily. I sent a quick message to Daniel Stevenson. "We have a problem. They're trying to trap me on my own land." The reply came instantly: "Stand your ground. We'll strike back." I sat at my kitchen table, spreading out all the documents before me. Diane had made her move first, but I had one she never saw coming. And this time, I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going on the offensive. I wasn't going to be imprisoned on my own property. If Diane thought she could break me with physical barriers and legal maneuvers, she had underestimated me. I needed allies, and I knew exactly where to find them. Leaving through the back road, one Diane hadn't managed to block yet, I drove straight into town. My first stop was the Meadow Creek Gazette, the only local newspaper that could help bring the truth to light. As I stepped inside, I spotted a familiar face behind the editorial desk. Tanya Williams, someone who had grown up in this town and knew exactly how things worked. Tanya raised an eyebrow as I dropped a stack of documents onto her desk. "I need you to take a look at this," I said. She flipped through the pages, her expression sharpening with every document she read. "You're telling me that the Sunny Pines HOA built on land that doesn't belong to them?" I nodded. "And they're trying to silence me by blocking access to my farm, cutting off my water and electricity, and using their connections to manipulate local authorities." Tanya sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I've heard rumors about this HOA for years, but no one ever had solid proof. If what you have here is real, then this isn't just a property dispute. This is corruption." She picked up her phone and called the newspaper's photographer. "We need pictures of the Sunny Pines construction site, immediately." Then she turned back to me. "I'll run an investigative piece, but I need more statements from people the HOA has strong-armed." I immediately thought of Mr. Grayson, a longtime resident who had been forced out of his home simply for planting tomato plants in his backyard, and Mrs. Jenkins, who had been fined hundreds of dollars for placing a porch swing in front of her house. I knew there were many more, victims of the HOA, whose voices had never been heard. "Give me a day," I said. "I'll bring you a list of people willing to speak up." Tanya nodded. "But you should know, Henry, when this article goes public, Diane won't sit quietly." I met her gaze, my eyes filled with determination. She started this war. It's time I fought back. That entire day, I went door to door across Meadow Creek, listening to the stories of those who had suffered under Sunny Pines HOA for years. Each account only strengthened my resolve. Mr. Grayson told me how the HOA had forced him to sell his home by repeatedly fining him for minor infractions that never existed before. Mrs. Jenkins recalled the day the HOA made her remove the porch swing her husband had installed 20 years ago, simply because it didn't align with the neighborhood aesthetic. The Martinez family had been fined $500 just for letting their kids play soccer in their own backyard in the afternoon. As I documented each story, a clear pattern emerged. Diane and the HOA board weren't just corrupt, they were bullies, exploiting the vulnerable for their own gain. That evening, I returned to the Meadow Creek Gazette with a long list of residents ready to fight back. Tanya scanned the list, then smiled. "You just gave me exactly what I needed." 2 days later, the article appeared on the front page with the headline, "Sunny Pines HOA, Authority or Abuse." The report exposed everything: the way the HOA used regulations to strong-arm residents, their financial fraud, and even proof that they had built on land that didn't belong to them. Alongside the article were photos of my farm, the unfinished construction sites, and even the documents I'd found in my grandfather's office. Diane didn't waste any time retaliating. That same afternoon, I received a threatening letter from the HOA's attorney, accusing me of defamation and threatening to sue me for damaging the reputation of Sunny Pines. But this time, I wasn't alone. My phone rang non-stop, residents from the area voicing their support, some even offering to testify if the case went to court. More importantly, the article had caught the attention of a reporter from a larger newspaper in the neighboring city, someone eager to dig even deeper into the story. Diane thought she could use the law to silence me, but she forgot one thing: justice is stronger than any legal maneuver. And now, the public knew the truth. I expected Diane Reynolds wouldn't sit quietly after the Meadow Creek Gazette article, but I didn't expect her to strike back so quickly. The next morning, when I stepped onto my porch, I found a notice plastered to my front door, a long list of building violations filed by the Sunny Pines HOA with the county. According to the report, my farm was deemed unsafe for occupancy due to non-compliant electrical systems, a hazardous porch, and even a driveway that fails to meet residential entry regulations. I let out a dry laugh. Diane was no longer just threatening me, she was trying to force me out by any means necessary. Not long after, my phone rang. Daniel Stevenson. Henry, I just received the notice. The HOA has officially filed a lawsuit, accusing you of defamation and demanding financial compensation for damages. I tightened my grip on the phone. They don't want to sue me, Daniel. They want me to be scared enough to back down. Daniel sighed. That's their old strategy, pushing people to the brink through legal pressure and financial strain. But I have good news. We just secured an official court order to launch a full investigation into the HOA's property boundaries and financial records. I felt a spark of hope. So we can prove they committed fraud? Not just that. Some members of the HOA board are starting to get nervous. They don't want to be dragged into this if it all comes crashing down. I think someone from their side will come forward soon. I knew Diane couldn't maintain control forever, especially now that the residents she had oppressed for years were finally finding their voices. And just as I expected, only a few hours later, I received an anonymous message. I have information about suspicious HOA finances. Meet me tonight. Tell no one. As darkness settled, I drove to the agreed meeting place, a small cafe on the outskirts of town. A man sat in a dimly lit corner, his hat pulled low, but I recognized him immediately. Gerald Fisher, the HOA treasurer. He slid a small USB drive across the table. I can't keep pretending I don't know what's going on, he said quietly. Diane and the board members are funneling HOA funds into shell companies. They've embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you want proof that this HOA is corrupt, this is it. I stared at the USB drive in my palm, my heartbeat pounding. Diane thought she could use power to crush me. But she forgot one thing. People like her can't hide the truth forever. And I was about to make sure the whole town saw it. I left the cafe, gripping the USB tightly, knowing I held the weapon that could destroy Diane Reynolds and the entire corrupt system behind Sunny Pines HOA. If what Gerald Fisher said was true, this wasn't just a property dispute anymore. This was a large-scale financial fraud. But I also knew that this had to be handled the right way. Back at the farm, I sat at my kitchen table and plugged the USB into my laptop. A flood of files appeared, financial reports, internal emails, and spreadsheets detailing how HOA funds had been siphoned off into companies linked to Diane, her husband, and several local officials. Over $400,000 in HOA fees had disappeared into untraceable accounts. Some maintenance and management expenses were double what they should have been, with no records proving the money was actually used to improve the community. I knew I couldn't keep this information to myself. I called Daniel Stevenson, and when he picked up, I couldn't hide the excitement in my voice. Daniel, I have proof. I have everything. 30 minutes later, we met at his office. Daniel examined each document carefully, occasionally furrowing his brow as he spotted particularly suspicious transactions. Henry, this is clear financial fraud. If we take this to court, Diane won't just lose the HOA. She could be facing criminal charges. I took a deep breath. We have to make this public. Every resident in this community needs to know how they've been deceived. Daniel nodded. But we need a bigger impact. If we rely only on local news, they might find a way to silence the story. I have a contact at the State Tribune, a major newspaper. If we get them involved, Diane won't be able to control the narrative anymore. I agreed immediately. We sent all the evidence to the State Tribune and alerted Meadow Creek Gazette so they could continue covering the story. I also sent copies of the documents to the district attorney's office, ensuring that these allegations wouldn't be swept under the rug. Within 24 hours, the story exploded. Sunny Pines HOA was no longer a feared organization. It had become the center of a scandal. Diane Reynolds might have thought she was untouchable, but now all eyes were on her. And I knew this time she had nowhere to hide. I expected Diane wouldn't sit quietly while everything collapsed around her. But this time, I was one step ahead. The next morning, when I stepped onto my porch, I saw a group of reporters waiting. The State Tribune had published the full expose, and now the entire town of Meadow Creek knew about the HOA's financial corruption. This wasn't just rumors anymore. This was a public scandal, and Diane Reynolds was directly in the spotlight. I spent the entire day answering reporters' questions, confirming the evidence I had gathered, and, most importantly, reaching out to the residents, the people who had endured the HOA's abuse for years. As night fell, I knew it was time for the next step, bringing everyone together to take back control of our community. I printed hundreds of flyers with a simple but powerful message: Meadow Creek Community Meeting. It's time to speak up. Driving through the neighborhood, I stuffed flyers into mailboxes, posted them on street poles, and most importantly, knocked on doors. I wasn't just inviting people to the meeting. I was listening to their stories, the injustices the HOA had inflicted, the unfair fees, the hidden threats. And with every conversation, I could feel it. The tide was finally turning. The following evening, as I stepped into the Meadow Creek Community Center, I had no idea what to expect. But when the doors swung open, I was met with an unbelievable sight. Nearly the entire community had shown up. Every seat was filled, people lined the walls, and all eyes were on me. Mrs. Thompson waved from the front row, while Mr. Grayson stood beside her, his eyes filled with hope. I stepped onto the stage and took a deep breath. "We've been silent for too long," I began, my voice echoing through the packed room. "Diane Reynolds and the Sunny Pines HOA have controlled our lives through fear, through unreasonable fees, through quiet threats. But today, that ends." A wave of applause erupted, but I raised my hand, signaling for calm. "We have two choices," I continued. "We can continue living in a community where our rights are trampled on, or we can stand together and make real change." Shouts of agreement rippled through the crowd. A man stood up, his voice strong. "Can we dissolve the HOA?" I nodded. "If we gather enough votes, we can hold an official election. And if we succeed, we can form a new organization, one that truly serves the residents." The room erupted in cheers. For the first time in weeks, I felt something Diane could no longer control: hope. The battle wasn't over yet, but tonight, I knew I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The next morning, word of the community meeting had spread across Meadow Creek. The people who once feared the Sunny Pines HOA now had a reason to hope, and Diane Reynolds surely knew it. I didn't have to wait long for her response. Less than an hour after leaving my farm, I returned to find an official letter from the HOA's attorney taped to my door. Its contents were predictable: warnings about disruptive behavior, demands for me to cease my false statements, and threats of a defamation lawsuit. But this time, something was different. Diane was no longer in control of the story. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through social media. Posts about the Sunny Pines HOA scandal were everywhere. Residents of Meadow Creek were sharing the expose from the State Tribune, recounting their own experiences of the abuses they had endured for years. Some even posted pictures of their absurd HOA violation letters, captioned with messages like, "We've had enough." When I arrived at Daniel Stevenson's office, he was already prepared with a plan. "We're officially filing a court petition to dissolve the Sunny Pines HOA," he said. "We have proof of financial fraud, abuse of power, And now we have the support of the residents. But we need one more step. We need an internal vote. I understood immediately. According to the bylaws, if enough homeowners in the community agreed, we could formally disband the HOA. That meant Diane Reynolds would lose all of her power. That evening, I returned to the Meadow Creek Community Center, where residents were ready to fight back. I brought the official petition that Daniel had prepared, a formal request to dissolve the HOA. As I looked around the packed room, I saw familiar faces, neighbors who had once been afraid, now filled with determination. "This is our chance," I said firmly. "If we sign this petition, we can take back control of our community. We can end the unreasonable fees, the threats, the meaningless rules they've imposed on us." One by one, people stepped forward to sign. I watched as Mr. Grayson, Mrs. Jenkins, the Martinez family, and dozens more put their names down with unwavering conviction. When the last signature was added, I counted them, more than the required number. Diane Reynolds had lost control, and Sunny Pines HOA was nothing more than a dying relic waiting to collapse. The next morning, as I delivered the petition to Daniel Stevenson's office, I knew we were closer than ever to victory. With more than enough signatures, the Sunny Pines HOA had no choice but to face the truth. They no longer controlled this community. But I also knew Diane Reynolds wouldn't accept defeat easily. And just as I expected, a few hours later, I received a text from an unknown number. "You just made a huge mistake. Can we talk before this goes too far?" I didn't need to ask who it was. It was Diane. But this time, she wasn't in control anymore. Instead of responding, I moved forward with the next crucial step, filing the official court petition to dissolve the Sunny Pines HOA, citing financial fraud and abuse of power. With the evidence Gerald Fisher had provided, combined with dozens of resident testimonies, our case was solid. And as news of the lawsuit spread, Diane had no choice but to face the reality she had tried so hard to avoid. That afternoon, I stepped into the Meadow Creek Community Center, where Diane had called an emergency meeting with the remaining HOA board members. The room was tenser than ever. Residents who had once feared the HOA now sat together, exchanging hopeful glances. I walked to the front, facing Diane. She crossed her arms, trying to maintain her composure, but I could see the unease in her eyes. "You think you can destroy everything I've built?" she said, her voice firm, but lacking the confidence it once held. I opened the folder in my hands and held it up for the entire room to see. "Not me," I said. "You did this to yourself. Here are the financial records showing hundreds of thousands of HOA dollars embezzled. Here is the official lawsuit petition to dissolve the HOA. And here is the signed petition, legally removing you from your position." Silence fell over the room. Then a woman stood up. "I've lost thousands of dollars to these ridiculous fees," she said. "I want this HOA gone." Then another, and another. Diane's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies. But this time, no one stood with her. For the first time since this battle began, I saw Diane Reynolds completely lose control. And I knew, at that moment, Sunny Pines HOA had reached its end. That evening, the Meadow Creek Community Center was no longer a place ruled by Diane Reynolds. The faces that had once feared Sunny Pines HOA were now filled with determination. As I stood before the crowd, holding the signed petition, I knew we had achieved something many once thought impossible. We had taken back control of our community. But there was still one final step to secure our victory. Diane sat stiffly in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests, her eyes scanning the room for any remaining support. But she found none. Even Gerald Fisher, the HOA treasurer, stood with us, ready to publicly expose the financial corruption he had witnessed. I stepped forward, my voice calm but resolute. "We have all the signatures needed to request the dissolution of Sunny Pines HOA. The court has accepted our lawsuit, and unless there is a valid objection, this HOA will cease to exist." A round of applause filled the room, but I wasn't finished. However, this isn't just about removing Diane Reynolds. We need to make sure no one else can abuse power the way she did. We can't allow a new HOA to rise with the same oppressive rules. Mrs. Thompson stood up, leaning on her cane. "What do you propose, Henry?" I nodded. I want to establish a new organization, the Meadow Creek Residents Association. No outrageous fees, no absurd rules, no one forced to sell their home just because they planted tomatoes in their backyard. The room fell silent for a moment, then someone started clapping. Another person stood up. I agree. We need an organization that serves the residents, not controls them. The applause grew louder until the entire room was united in agreement. This wasn't just the downfall of the Sunny Pines HOA. This was the rebirth of a community. Diane shot to her feet, trying to regain her sharp tone. You think you've won? This is my home. I'm not going anywhere. I looked at her, my voice steady. You can stay, I said. But this time, you'll have to live by the rules that we all decide together. No more special privileges. No more control. Only fairness. Diane opened her mouth as if to argue, but then she realized the battle was over, and she had lost. The story of Henry Walker's fight to reclaim his land and community was not just a legal battle, but a powerful reminder of perseverance, justice, and unity. It proved that even when facing powerful forces and corruption, a determined individual with righteousness on their side could make a difference. For older generations, this story carries an important lesson. Legacy isn't just about land. It's about honor, values, and the principles we pass down. Henry's grandfather left behind more than just a farm. He left a foundation of integrity and responsibility. In life, there will be times when we are tested, when we are pressured to surrender what is rightfully ours. But as Henry proved, when we stand firm in defending what's just, we don't just protect our own rights. We inspire an entire community. Sometimes, true strength isn't in what we own, but in what we are willing to stand up and fight for.